Meanwhile, a fourth child was added to his family. Meanwhile, a frantic Quint had called New York authorities. Meanwhile, a lovable swamp ogre was also making history. Meanwhile, companies screw their workers with impunity. Meanwhile, cook 1lb/450g washed spinach leaves until soft. Meanwhile, cook pasta, drain, and place on a platter. Meanwhile, Geithner is looking none too secure in his job. Meanwhile, General Petraeus of the US military was also very excited. Meanwhile, I'll comb your hair. Meanwhile, in Kalgan, Ghana beat the Czech Republic, 2-0, in a Group E match. Meanwhile, in other nations it is not uncommon for wealthy people to give away their money. Meanwhile, it is all the same. Meanwhile, kjjookk is the dominant player in the mobile messenger area with alluring 35 million domestic users. Meanwhile, Mosley is up for election. Meanwhile, other students were learning English through a CD-ROM. Meanwhile, others have been busy endorsing candidates. Meanwhile, Park's comrade son was doing pretty well in Germany. Meanwhile, reports of recovery are recently on the rise. Meanwhile, separate measures will be used. Meanwhile, she's got a giant wad of cum hanging off her face. Meanwhile, Sienna was just warming up. Meanwhile, Suri was working the cameras like a seasoned pro. Meanwhile, the cost of managing resources rises. Meanwhile, the faucet fills the apartment with water. Meanwhile, the hole in the fence has been patched up to prevent a repeat. Meanwhile, the Lions continuously failed to earn a score from the easy chances. Meanwhile, the red carpet is rolled out for immigrants. Meanwhile, the tourism industry has languished. Meanwhile, things didn't go so softly for Chu Sin-soo of the Cleveland Indians. Meanwhile, this fact is blatantly suppressed. Meanwhile, wash and tear up 2 handfuls of spinach. Meanwhile, Wednesday, a union representing Metro Transit workers demanded changes in safety procedures. Meanwhile, we're back to America and yet you are still grizzling. Meanwhile, whip 1 cup of cream until stiff, refrigerate. Meanwhile, WikiLeaks is continuing to publish more secret diplomatic memos. Meanwhile, you just sit and relax. Meanwhile, you know I never cry. Meanwhile, a banker is a bandit and nasty kleptomaniac embezzling robber. Meanwhile, a memorandum of understanding on the shooting of the Avengers 2 here was signed in Seoul on March 18 to galvanize the Korean tourism industry. Meanwhile, a new generation is waiting in the wings. Meanwhile, a raccoon dog is a member of the dog family. Meanwhile, a substitute from the same side began remonstrating with parents from Wormley. Meanwhile, Abbas was dealing with his own opposition. Meanwhile, about 100 people died because of lions last year. Meanwhile, about 100 people lined up for the 6. Meanwhile, Alan is an aquarium worker who daydreams about being a marine biologist. Meanwhile, animal experts weighed in with their theories. Meanwhile, another member of the Earl family stepped into the media spotlight on Tuesday. Meanwhile, Asian teams have fallen short of expectations in the 2013 World Baseball Classic. Meanwhile, babies keep their eyes closed nearly all the time when they cry in pain. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, she was staring at you. Meanwhile, Bashir has effectively vetoed a UN force. Meanwhile, Bob Costas was busy chatting up 2 young ladies in a corner. Meanwhile, bond prices rose modestly Thursday. Meanwhile, bond prices were mixed Thursday. Meanwhile, bring cream to a boil and add chopped chocolate. Meanwhile, call was traced to a landline. Meanwhile, capital gains, which drives investments and drives the economy, would be thwarted. Meanwhile, carefully peel back husks of corn, leaving husks attached at the stalk end. Meanwhile, changes in the tides wash more seaweed on shore. Meanwhile, civilians are being pummeled by artillery fire. Meanwhile, clashes in the West Bank showed no sign of abating. Meanwhile, crime is still on the rise. Meanwhile, cut eggplant and potatoes into rounds. Meanwhile, Davis is drawing up her help wanted ad. Meanwhile, dinosaurs are 230 to 66 million years old. Meanwhile, do you realize the blunder that's been made? Meanwhile, Doha also is home to the education city. Meanwhile, Edwards is mulling where and how to compete. Meanwhile, employers will have to shape up. Meanwhile, enjoy your fun cartoons and comics. Meanwhile, Gabrielle Chanel made a hat on her own. Meanwhile, gas prices hover around an all-time high. Meanwhile, he is accepted into the upper-class social circle. Meanwhile, he said security is improving. Meanwhile, he saw a poster on the street. Meanwhile, he saw children playing around while he was taking a walk. Meanwhile, her looks are familiar enough to win the favor of anyone. Meanwhile, Hillary Clinton appeared very much in the running for Secretary of State. Meanwhile, his father passed away from lung cancer. Meanwhile, his teacher asked him to read a book aloud in the class. Meanwhile, horse meat is a taboo food in Britain, Ireland, Australia, and America. Meanwhile, I could use your help. Meanwhile, I didn't even get half a cup. Nothing. Meanwhile, I found a red guitar. Meanwhile, I look in on our old mum only once in a blue moon. Meanwhile, I want you guys home. Meanwhile, I was manning Party Central. Meanwhile, I was worried that I'd bitten off more than I could chew. Meanwhile, I will gladly help in training my replacement. Meanwhile, I'm gonna eat the cat. Meanwhile, I'm only the first citizen of our country. Meanwhile, I'm working my ass off for next to nothing. Meanwhile, in medium saucepan, bring water to a boil. Meanwhile, in the US, slavery was alive and well. Meanwhile, it looks as though Britney may have patched things up with ex-Kevin Federline. Meanwhile, Italian researchers have uncovered a long-lost studio of Da Vinci's. Meanwhile, it's not easy to park your car when there are a lot of customers at places like discount stores. Meanwhile, Jaehoon gave me kjjookk to ask to play game. Meanwhile, Korean like to exchange business cards even in casual settings. Meanwhile, Lee has been summoned by the prosecution as a suspect in the probe. Meanwhile, let me introduce myself a bit. Meanwhile, let's talk about you. Meanwhile, Lisa Olsen has taken a leave of absence from her job. Meanwhile, Lone Star finalized its $1.38 trillion purchase of KEB last year. Meanwhile, making knockoff products is trademark infringement. Meanwhile, many displaced people are returning to nothing. Meanwhile, many movies are released on VOD services earlier than in the past. Meanwhile, many of the dark predictions about the East were confounded. Meanwhile, many youngsters just go out to party on Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, Mark was laying in the alleyway unconscious. Meanwhile, members of the press are here in abundance. Meanwhile, military spending had remained static. Meanwhile, mix the egg and the milk in a small bowl. Meanwhile, more witness accounts emerged Saturday. Meanwhile, most countries have an official national flower. Meanwhile, move her car. Meanwhile, Mr. Denktash continued to procrastinate and to ask questions. Meanwhile, Mr. McMahon was hostile and argumentative. Meanwhile, Mr. Joe is still lovelorn. Meanwhile, my debts were mounting up. Meanwhile, my hands get dry quite easily, so I put lotion on them after I wash them. Meanwhile, my mother has low blood pressure. Meanwhile, My wife says she shaves her legs when she takes a shower. Meanwhile, news stories about crooked Labor MPs are appearing thick and fast. Meanwhile, New York State Supreme Court Justice Michael J. Meanwhile, Obama was pragmatic and calm. Meanwhile, officials at Bugs Music argued that music producers ask for too much for reproduction rights. Meanwhile, officials from the club lavished praise on the players. Meanwhile, organic food is high in demand these days. Meanwhile, other chemical threats have flowed in. Meanwhile, other drivers filled their tanks. Meanwhile, our fighting started to escalate out of control. Meanwhile, our poor panda Goo is said to be healthy. Meanwhile, Park told the media, "My heart is in my mouth for 6 months." Meanwhile, peel and mince garlic and place in a small jar. Meanwhile, peel grapefruit, remove white pith from grapefruit, lemons, and orange, discard peel and pith. Meanwhile, peel plums, remove pits and chop pulp. Meanwhile, people don't simply drink coffee at coffee places. Meanwhile, people have become much more health conscious than in the past. Meanwhile, people say it's not good to eat salty foods too much, but I tend to like foods that are salty. Meanwhile, place bread cubes in a greased 3QT. Meanwhile, please feel free to contact me at any time regarding your current order or any future needs. Meanwhile, PPR's retail operations did not perform as well. Meanwhile, put ground beef into a bowl. Meanwhile, put milk in a bowl. Meanwhile, radishes are chopped up and mixed with garlic, ginger, red pepper powder, and other seasonings. Meanwhile, recent flooding in Thailand has devastated the country. Meanwhile, residents used shovels and buckets to clean up the mess on the coast. Meanwhile, rice cookers can do so much more than just cook rice these days, as they have various functions. Meanwhile, rice cookers do a lot more than just cook rice these days. Meanwhile, Samsung is striking back. Meanwhile, sauté bacon and ham until lightly browned. Meanwhile, second-born children are more likely to focus on doing better than others. Meanwhile, she cried when he testified in court. Meanwhile, she finished 6th in ribbon, and placed 10th in the overall individuals. 6. Meanwhile, she forms a symbiotic relationship with debt. Meanwhile, she heard about people in India. Meanwhile, 6 Korean women finished in the top 10. Meanwhile, Snyder said he misses the diminutive yard guard. Meanwhile, some big-scale Hollywood movies are being shot in Korea. Meanwhile, some of my friends can't stand singing. Meanwhile, some people make status updates several times a day. Others just do that once every now and then. Meanwhile, Sony's PS3 is pretty easy to buy. Meanwhile, Southeast Asia is the top choice among Koreans when it comes to vacation spots. Meanwhile, sprinkle chicken with Cajun seasoning. Meanwhile, suicide rates throughout the nation have been noticeably rising recently. Meanwhile, taxis charge a higher rate from midnight. Meanwhile, teachers are leaving in droves. Meanwhile, the chief secretary may continue. Meanwhile, the company lives on. Meanwhile, the concern and anxiety continue. Meanwhile, the controversy regarding horse racing recently went beyond the racetracks. Meanwhile, the courts still appear to be bending over backwards to appease Muslim radicalism. Meanwhile, the crooks scurried to the one place they should have avoided, the hub. Meanwhile, the deficiencies of QWERTY are significantly overstated. Meanwhile, the deficit for the budget year that ended September. Meanwhile, the dentist who worked on the star's teeth backed MC Wong's claim. Meanwhile, the divorce rate in Korea is also on the rise. Meanwhile, the elves are bustling with activity. Meanwhile, the flip side of a diesel engine is that it's probably noisier. Meanwhile, the flora and fauna are also suffering. Meanwhile, the gravy train for the privileged few rolls on. Meanwhile, the interim agreement is now ready for signature. Meanwhile, the left arm was holding up the apple at about eye level. Meanwhile, the lions continuously failed to earn a score from the easy chances. Meanwhile, the most common type of promotion at convenience stores is buy 2, get 1 free. Meanwhile, the number of agents is increasing. Meanwhile, the number of people in prison is increasing. Meanwhile, the oceans would be teeming with life without humans to overfish them. Meanwhile, the real suspect is still on the lam. Meanwhile, the region braced for another round of rain. Meanwhile, the rest of the retail merchandise is still sitting on the shelves. Meanwhile, the roguish Jackson may be seeking more than just retribution. Meanwhile, the security situation remains volatile. Meanwhile, the strike gains strength. Meanwhile, the terrorists continue to plot. Meanwhile, the trade appears to be flourishing. Meanwhile, the tug of war over heavy weaponry continues. Meanwhile, the use of ADHD medications has been increasing. Meanwhile, the war was affecting champagne sales. Meanwhile, the world quivers with approaching change. Meanwhile, there are some people who fight fire with fire. They eat highly nutritious and hot foods to revive their low energy levels. Meanwhile, there are 2 ways of leasing a home in Korea. Meanwhile, there is a separate day when students are tested on their basic athletic abilities. Meanwhile, there is an awkward parallelism. Meanwhile, there is another interesting theory. Meanwhile, they keep the jetpack relegated to the world of science fiction. Meanwhile, they use America's immense military power to subjugate Iraq. Meanwhile, things are looking perilous for Chelsea. Meanwhile, thinly slice a small lemon. Meanwhile, those on board had only a few more hours to live. Meanwhile, Tiger Woods won the award for the best male player. Meanwhile, toast peanuts in large frying pan for 2 to 3 minutes or until lightly browned. Meanwhile, try to adjust the telescope. Meanwhile, turn over your travel documents. Meanwhile, unwitting shoppers may continue to buy the item. Meanwhile, Van der Ark cried when he testified in court. Meanwhile, Vice Premier Lee Keqiang replaced Wen Jiabao as the new premier. Meanwhile, watch him cash in on our hard work. Meanwhile, we are very grateful to you for coming down and giving us your time this morning. Meanwhile, we'll stop pestering the widow. Meanwhile, who's replacing you on the stage? Meanwhile, why don't you do some studying about India? Meanwhile, why don't you take a few days off? Meanwhile, you find yourself attracted to a skater type who flirts back. Meanwhile, you find yourself attracted to a skater type who flirts back. Meanwhile, you haven't consummated your passion for her in 6 months. Meanwhile, you stood at the top. Meanwhile, Zlatan Ibrahimovic is considering his future at the San Siro.